Good morning. Today we look at John chapter 7, verses 28 through 53. And Jesus has been, at the Festival of Booths, Festival of Tabernacles, whichever you want to call it. He went there secretly to begin with, and then about halfway through he began teaching in the temple. And the people, especially the scribes and the Pharisees, were upset by this because, he wasn't taught, didn't have the learning. And the people then began to start believing in Jesus as the Messiah, because in verse 28 and following, when we start, it says, he spoke as he was teaching in the temple. You know me, and you know where I am from. I have not come on my own, but the one who sent me is true, and you do not know him. I know him because I have been sent from him. He's referring to being sent from heaven. And some of the people believe, and others don't. And the chief priests, the Sadducees and the Pharisees take offense at what Jesus is saying here. And they send the temple police to arrest him. And I always think it's surprising that they have temple police. I mean, I can't imagine going into one of our churches and finding police officers all over. I mean, I suppose there's some of them in the bigger congregations, bigger cities that, maybe they got guards and stuff. I don't know. But temple police to me is just a strange thought, strange deal. But they send the temple police to arrest him. And while the police are there, Jesus is still speaking. And he says, I will be with you a little longer, and then I'm going to him who sent me. Again, referring that, he's here on earth, but he's going to be returning back to heaven, to God, the one who sent him. And, it says they question, where is this man going to go that we can't find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks? And that goes way back to, when Israel was conquered, Jerusalem was captured, and the Israelites were dispersed. They were, some taken off captive to Babylon, and others just, fled to wherever. And this is what happened then. And some, went to Samaria, and some, intermingled and intermarried there. And so then they became just like the Gentiles, unworthy. And so the Jews, the religious leaders, are wondering, well, is Jesus going to be going out and preaching and teaching to them that we're not going to be able to find him? Is he going to disappear into the foreign countries? But that wasn't what he was meaning at all. He kept referring, that way that he would be in time returning to heaven. And they were asking, well, what does he mean by you will search for me and you will not find? Where I am, you cannot come. He's talking about his death and resurrection in a very veiled manner, but they don't catch that. I mean, they, whether their minds and their hearts are hardened, or they're just not open to it. And, there are so many people today too that are, just not open to hearing a new word or things that way. And then on the verse 37, on the last day of the festival, Jesus was standing, and he said, let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and I will give them drink, and out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water. And during this festival of the booths, festival of the tabernacle, the religious leaders, part of the ceremony was that they would carry water from the pool of Siloam to the temple. And so when Jesus was talking about, anyone who thirsts comes to me, it was somewhat referring to, that water, that sacred holy water, whatever they wanted to call it. But it was for, during the festival, it was a reminder that God had instructed Moses to strike the rock, and then that the water had come from the rock, so that the Jews, the Israelites who were wandering in the wilderness for those 40 years. At that time, they got that water to drink. And it was, some of the symbolism that they were carrying on of their traditions and some of all of what they had done that way. And so when Jesus is talking and teaching, there are some that are beginning to believe. Verse 40, when they heard these words, some in the crowd said, "This is the prophet." Others said, "This is the Messiah." But others said, the Messiah is not to come from Galilee. He's supposed to be a descendant of David, come from Bethlehem. And, and this is a part of the hiddenness of the works of God, is that, Jesus is an offspring of David. He was born in Bethlehem because Joseph was there with Mary, pregnant as she was, to be registered in the city of David because he was a descendant of David, of King David. But he was raised in Nazareth of Galilee, which just totally, people didn't understand that. And maybe very many of them didn't know that about Jesus, it wasn't public records. It wasn't talked about widely, but, maybe there were a few that remembered, those 30 years earlier or however long it was that, the angels had come to the shepherds and the shepherds had proclaimed the birth of this child and all of the joy. But, we don't hear any of that, as Jesus begins his ministry. It's all trying to start over again. And, the miracle of his birth and the joyous message, I come to bring good news of great joy for all the people. This was the message when Jesus was born. This was the message of the angels to the shepherds. Good news of great joy for all the people. But, that had been forgotten. Mary had pondered those words in her heart, all this time and everything. But, it was still, it was kind of forgotten history that way. And in here, when just to back up a little bit, when the temple police had come to arrest Jesus, John tells us in verse 30, they weren't able to arrest him, lay hands on him, because it wasn't his hour yet. And that's, if you remember back in chapter 2, when Mary, his mother, told the servants, to do whatever he says, Jesus says, "My hour is not yet." And we hear Jesus say, "My hour is not yet," a few different times in the Gospel of John. And then when we get into chapter 12, as he's talking with his disciples, and with in chapter 12, 13, 14, as he has his last supper with them and all that, the hour has come, that the Son of Man is to be glorified. And, Jesus talking about, the Son of Man glorified, this is his death on the cross and his resurrection. That's his glory. So as of yet, his hour had not yet come, but he was in the midst of doing his ministry, in the midst of encouraging people to believe and to trust. And so as I've been just talking, in the verses 41 and 2 and 3 and 4, that people were, Messiah isn't to come from Galilee, from Nazareth, and but it goes on, and the temple police who had been sent to arrest Jesus go back to the chief priests, the Pharisees, and the chief priests. Many of them were part of the group of the Sadducees, but the police went back without arresting Jesus, and it's, well, has he converted you too? It's just, but they had heard the words that Jesus was speaking. But a part of it was that, it wasn't yet his time. And as everybody was talking against Jesus, John, the gospel writer, reminds us that Nicodemus, who had gone and visited with Jesus, reminded the others, he says, our law does not judge people without first giving them a hearing to find out who they are, does it? And of course, the rest of them, well, has he converted you too? You search the scriptures and you see if you can find anything that the prophet would come from Galilee, And then it says they went home. That's where we end at chapter 7 today. They went home because they didn't want to hear anymore. They didn't know how to deal with it. And it was just so confusing. And in many ways, we still wonder today that it's kind of confusing, some of what Jesus teaches and preaches. But God's love is constant, there for us each and every day.